The weeping walls. At 3:14 a.m., with the sound of a single, rhythmic drip echoing through his bedroom, Elias Thorne understood that the walls of his house were not leaking. They were crying. And by dawn, he would discover that what the town had buried 70 years ago was not a secret. It was a body, his mother's body, and everyone in Oakhaven had known it all along. The mattress beneath him was still warm. That was the first strange thing Elias noticed when his eyes snapped open in the darkness. His cotton sheets were damp, but not from sweat. The room smelled like salt water and distant thunder. Outside his window, rain hammered against the glass in steady, deliberate rhythms. But there was another sound underneath it. A single, perfect note of water striking hardwood. Plink, plink, plink. Elias turned his head to the left. The pale blue floral wallpaper of his bedroom caught what little light came from the storm clouds rolling past the moon. He could see the pattern clearly. Cornflowers and trailing vines, the same design his father had chosen 40 years ago. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed red. 3:14 a.m. He'd been asleep for exactly 2 hours. He sat up, pushing aside the heavy wool blanket. The mattress shifted beneath him, and for a moment the dripping sound stopped, as if pausing to acknowledge his movement. Then it began again. Plink, plink, plink. Elias swung his feet onto the dark oak floor. The wood was cold. He leaned forward, hunching toward the wall, trying to locate the source of the sound. There. A bead of perfectly clear liquid emerged from the center of a printed cornflower. It was absolutely transparent, catching the faint red glow from the clock face. The droplet rolled down the wallpaper slowly, like a tear on a human cheek, leaving a faint trail of moisture. When it reached the baseboard, it simply pooled there, waiting. Elias reached out his right index finger. He touched the droplet while it was still on the wall. It wasn't cold. It wasn't slimy. It was warm, blood-warm, and completely ordinary in every way, except for the fact that it was coming from inside the plaster. He pulled his hand back quickly, wiping the moisture onto his cotton pajama bottoms in a reflexive gesture of disgust. The dripping continued. 3 more drops fell from the same spot while he watched. They accelerated, forming a thin stream that carved the paths through the dust on the wallpaper. Elias rose and walked to his vanity, his hand moving on its own. He grabbed a white terry cloth towel and pressed it firmly against the wall, rubbing in a circular motion to dry the spot. He held it there for 5 seconds, counting the beats of his heart. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then he pulled it away. The towel was soaked instantly in a circle the size of a fist. Elias stared at the wet fabric in his palm. The wall did not dry. Instead, 3 more drops emerged from the same spot, and then 4, then 5. They accelerated into a stream, running down the wallpaper and soaking into the baseboard. The towel in his hand was dripping clear liquid onto his knuckles. He dropped it as if it had burned him. The towel hit the floor with a heavy thud, and the sound seemed to echo through the entire house. "It won't stop," he whispered to the empty room. "It's coming from inside." He stood there in the darkness for 5 minutes, maybe longer. He couldn't say afterward. He simply watched the liquid emerge from the wall, watched it run, watched it pool on his hardwood floor. The dripping sound continued beneath the sound of the rain outside. Steady, patient, inevitable, like something trying to communicate with him through the only language it had left. When he finally moved, it was toward the door. He needed coffee. He needed light. He needed to convince himself that walls in old houses sometimes did this, that old plaster sometimes sweated, that the humidity from the storm was doing something to the materials. He would put on a pot of coffee and sit in the kitchen and wait for dawn, and then, in the morning, he would call someone. A contractor, a professional, someone who could explain what was happening. He didn't call anyone, and in the morning, he would discover that no one in Oakhaven wanted it explained at all. The cobblestone square was gray and still when Elias pushed through the wooden doors of the general store near noon. The rain had stopped, leaving everything damp and slick. A man in a green-painted porch sat with a tin mug of coffee, his posture relaxed despite the cold. This was Silas, the town elder. Though he held no official position, he was simply the oldest, and the oldest carried weight in a town like Oakhaven. Elias walked briskly across the stones, his boots clacking with purpose. His coat was buttoned incorrectly. The top button went through the second hole, and his hair was wild. He hadn't slept after discovering the weeping wall. Instead, he'd sat in his kitchen, watching the sun rise over the empty forest, trying to remember if his father had ever mentioned anything about structural problems with the house. "Silas," Elias called out when he was still 10 feet away. "I need to talk to you. Something is happening in my house. The walls in my bedroom are—" A tall man with a beard stepped off the porch. Marcus. He moved with the certainty of someone who had never questioned his own strength. His canvas jacket was worn soft by years of work, and his calloused hands were the kind that had built or destroyed 100 things. He put one of these hands on Elias's chest, leaning his weight forward in a way that was almost casual. "Where are you going in such a rush, Thorne?" Marcus asked, his voice a low rumble. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Elias tried to push past the man's arm. Marcus grabbed his left bicep and twisted, forcing him downward. Pain shot through Elias's shoulder socket. He swung his right fist instinctively, catching Marcus in the collarbone, but it did little more than make a dull thud against the man's solid frame. "Let me go," Elias shouted, his voice cracking. "Silas needs to know about the walls. Something is wrong with the town. Something is—" Marcus shoved him backward hard. Elias's back hit a pile of wooden crates, and the impact scattered them like kindling. He fell through the splintering wood, landing on his shoulder blade. The pain was sharp and immediate. 2 other locals stepped forward, standing over him as he lay in the debris. Their shadows fell across his face. "Nobody talks about the walls," Marcus said, standing above him now. His shadow was wider than his actual body. "We keep our mouths shut and our houses dry. You got it?" Elias looked up at Silas. The elder was still on the porch. He looked down at the scene below him with cold eyes. He didn't help. He didn't intervene. He simply finished the dregs of his coffee, poured the brown liquid over the porch rail, and walked inside the store. The screen door slammed with a finality that echoed across the square. The latch clicked shut. Elias lay in the debris of the crates for a long time. No one helped him up. Eventually, he rose on his own, his ribs aching with a pain that would worsen over the next several hours. His left cheek was bleeding from a small cut where splinters had caught his skin. He pushed the broken wood away and stood on wobbly legs, aware that people were watching him from windows and doorways across the square. Everyone had seen what Marcus did. Everyone had seen Silas refuse to help. Everyone had seen the silence enforced, simple and brutal. Elias walked back toward his house on the hill without looking back. He didn't understand what he'd done wrong, why asking a question about water damage had triggered such a violent response. He only knew that he needed to find answers somewhere else. And as he walked, a thought began to form in his mind. a thought that the town was keeping something hidden. A secret about the walls, a secret about the weeping. He needed to find the old records, the archives. The basement of the archive building was cold and smelled of mold. Elias had waited until late afternoon, until the woman who worked at the front desk had locked up and driven away. He'd circled the building 3 times, noting that the basement window was loose in its frame. Using a metal pry bar he'd found in his garage, he forced it open wide enough to slide through. His feet hit a pile of dusty burlap sacks that cushioned his landing, and he lay still in the silence for 5 minutes, listening for any sign that he'd been heard. Nothing came, just the sound of dust settling and the distant call of crows. He moved to the shelving unit labeled in faded marker, 1950-1960. The air was so thick with dust that each breath felt deliberate. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled out the first heavy, leather-bound ledger. The cover was moldy, its edges feathered and soft. He wiped the dust away with his sleeve, and the title became visible through layers of gray powder. Log of the Silent Year. Silent Year. Elias had never heard of such a thing, and he'd lived in Oakhaven his entire life. Surely his father would have mentioned it. Surely someone, somewhere, would have let the knowledge slip. He flipped to a random page. The handwriting was old-fashioned and precise. The entry was dated September 1954. Below it was a hand-drawn map of the town, rendered in blue ink. Every house was marked with a red X. Below the map, in a different hand, sharper, more aggressive, was a single note. The salt water rises when the guilt remains. Elias stared at those words. Salt water. His heart accelerated. He'd assumed the liquid from his walls was plain water, perhaps mixed with minerals from the old plaster. But salt water? Why would anyone write such a thing? Why would anyone draw a map marking every house in the town and label it with such cryptic words? His hands moved quickly through the pages. Most of the entries were mundane records of rainfall, temperature, and maintenance notes. But some entries were strange. One from October 1954 mentioned that the walls have begun to speak in the east wing. Another, from November, stated that 3 families have abandoned their homes due to the tears. Silas says we must contain this information or the town will be marked. Elias reached the back of the ledger. A photograph was tucked into the rear pocket. He withdrew it carefully. The image showed 2 men standing beside a massive trench filled with water. The trench was perhaps 30 feet long and 10 feet deep. Both men were young, much younger than they were now. One was Silas. The other was a man Elias recognized from old photographs in his father's study. His own father. The date was written on the back in careful script. Sept 1954, the day we buried it. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Elias froze, the photograph trembling in his hands. He waited. The sound didn't repeat. Just one creak, probably settling wood or door moving in the wind. But the knowledge had already settled into his mind with a terrible finality. His father hadn't just known about whatever was happening in the town. He'd helped. He'd been there with a shovel. He'd been there on the day they buried it. Elias turned back to the ledger. The pages were damp now. He touched one. It was wet, actively weeping the same clear liquid that had emerged from his bedroom wall. The ink was beginning to blur where the moisture touched it. The book itself was crying, releasing its secrets into the air like humidity from a broken seal. It's not just walls, he whispered to the silent basement. It's the history. He tucked the ledger under his arm and moved toward the basement window. He had to climb back through the way he'd come. He had to get home. He had to understand what his father had done and why it had waited 70 years to come back. The linoleum floor of his kitchen was covered in half an inch of standing water when Elias returned home. It wasn't coming from the pipes above. He could hear the pipes in his head, could trace their roots through the walls. This water was bubbling out from the gaps in the baseboards themselves, as if the house was sweating from the inside out. He held the ledger tight to his chest, the pages already soaking through his shirt. He moved to the kitchen sink to set the book down, to drain it, to save it. He didn't make it that far. A figure in a black raincoat lunged from behind the refrigerator. The intruder wore a burlap mask, its surface stained and crude. In his right hand was an iron pipe, heavy and dented from years of use. He swung it like a baseball bat, the pipe whistling through the air with the sound of something heavy moving fast enough to kill. Elias ducked. The pipe smashed into a wooden chair behind him, shattering the backrest into splinters. The impact of the blow reverberated through the kitchen. Elias threw the ledger onto the counter and grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the stovetop. His hand moved purely on instinct. He'd never been in a fight before this day. The masked man swung again. This time the pipe came from the side, aiming for Elias's ribs. Elias raised the skillet defensively, and the pipe struck the cast iron with a sound like a bell. The shock of the impact traveled up his arms and into his shoulders. He swung back, using the skillet like a club. It connected with the intruder's shoulder with a meaty thunk that brought a grunt of pain from beneath the mask. The man shoved Elias. His hands found Elias's chest and drove him backward with surprising strength. Elias slipped on the wet linoleum floor, his feet sliding out from under him. He hit the oven with his back, and the impact drove the air from his lungs. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He only lay against the warm metal, gasping like a fish. The intruder moved toward the counter. He was reaching for the ledger. Elias kicked out instinctively, his boot connecting with the man's shin. The intruder yelled, a sound of pure pain, and stumbled backward. He caught himself against the doorframe and limped out into the rain without looking back. The door swung open on its hinges, banging against the wall. Elias lay on the floor in a half-inch of water, breathing hard. His ribs were on fire. His left arm ached from the impact with the oven. But the ledger was still on the counter, and the intruder was gone. He remained there for 5 minutes, doing nothing but breathing. He watched water bubble up between the linoleum tiles. He watched it pool around his body. He listened to the sound of the rain outside and the wind moving through the open door. Slowly, his heart returned to its normal rhythm. Slowly, the pain became something he could think around. The intruder had known about the ledger. Someone in town had sent him. Someone who didn't want the contents of that book reaching the light of day. And Elias had defended it. Defended a collection of secrets about his own father, about a town that was literally trying to kill him to keep its silence. He stood up, grabbed the ledger, and headed for the attic. If his father had buried secrets, maybe the attic was where he'd buried them deepest. The rickety ladder creaked under his weight. Elias climbed with the flashlight clenched in his teeth, the leather-bound ledger tucked under his left arm. The attic door frame was saturated. Water was dripping onto his head like a steady faucet, each drop hitting cold and wet. He could hear water moving somewhere inside the walls, not just dripping, but flowing, moving with purpose like something alive. The attic was thick with dust and darkness. He pushed aside a stack of old moth-eaten coats, their fabric so brittle that they practically disintegrated in his hands. Behind them was a false wall made of plywood, waterlogged and swollen. He kicked it hard. The wood was so saturated that it collapsed on the first impact, fragments of particle board scattering across the floor like the skin of some diseased animal. Behind the false wall was a small room. It couldn't have been more than 4 feet wide and 6 feet long. Barely a closet, really. But it was a space his father had built and hidden. A space kept secret for 70 years. "We will make sure the town forgets." Elias looked at the photograph again. Eleanor, a woman with a scar over her eye. A woman his father had known. A woman his father apparently hadn't mentioned in the 32 years since Elias had been born. He turned back to the wall of the secret room. It wasn't just weeping now. It was pouring. The water was bubbling out in rhythmic pulses, and when Elias pressed his ear to the cold stone, he could hear something underneath the sound of water. A sound like sobbing. A sound like a woman's voice filtered through 70 years of earth and stone, and the weight of a town's silence. He felt the wall vibrate against his ear, felt the moisture soaking into his shirt, felt something trying to communicate with him from the other side. The water was forming patterns on the surface, almost like a shape, almost like a hand reaching out from inside the stone. Silas was waiting for him at the town monument. The elders stood beneath the bronze statue of a founding father, his posture upright and regal. In his hand was a kerosene lantern that cast everything below it in a sickly yellow light. 2 figures stood nearby, masked and silent. Elias recognized them as the men he'd seen in the square, local men, townsmen, people who'd known him his whole life. "You went digging where the ground was supposed to be flat, Elias," Silas said. His voice was calm, almost disappointed. That was a mistake. Elias held up the letters. His sleeve was soaked to the elbow from the water in his house. He pointed toward the hill where his home sat, and even from this distance, he could see that the windows were glowing strangely orange, not from light inside, but from something else. From the walls themselves, glowing with a color that didn't belong to the natural world. "The house is screaming," Elias said, and he meant it literally. "The whole town is starting to drown in what you did to that woman. Eleanor, my mother's Silas. You helped my father murder my mother." Silas checked a heavy silver pocket watch. The click of it opening echoed across the square. He looked at the time. 11:45 p.m. He snapped it shut with a sharp, final sound. "By dawn, if those letters aren't in my hand, we bring the torches," Silas said flatly. "We won't have the town ruined by your father's ghost. We won't have the truth drag us down with it." The 2 masked men stepped forward. They carried long wooden poles tipped with rags. The smell of gasoline filled the air around them, a sharp, chemical odor that burned the inside of Elias's nose. He understood what they were showing him. He understood what would happen to his house if he didn't comply. He understood that they had already decided what needed to happen. He turned and ran, not toward his house, toward the forest, toward the place where the old well sat, overgrown with ivy and forgotten. Silas watched him disappear into the tree line. The lantern held high, made no move to follow. The stone well was overgrown with gray ivy, its surface cracked and ancient. It wasn't empty. It was overflowing. Salt water spilled over the sides like a fountain, running down the outside of the structure in rivulets that had carved channels into the stone over decades. The water was thick, almost like liquid glass, and it moved with a strange sluggishness that suggested it was denser than ordinary salt water. "Eleanor," Elias whispered. The water roared in response, not a metaphorical roar, but a literal sound, like a physical voice screaming from somewhere deep inside the earth. The well exploded. Water shot upward in a column 10 feet high, and with it came debris. Pieces of white fabric, shreds of cloth that had been dissolved and reconstituted 1,000 times over. A wedding dress. The remnants of a burial dress that had been rotting in a well for 70 years. Marcus emerged from the trees, holding a snub-nosed revolver. He pointed it at Elias's chest with the casual confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome of this encounter. "End of the line, Thorne," Marcus said, his voice gravelly with age. "Give me the letters." Elias lurched forward without thinking. The decision came from somewhere below conscious thought, some ancient part of his brain that recognized survival instinct and acted on it. He tackled Marcus hard. They both fell into the knee-deep waters surrounding the well. The revolver went off, the flash bright white in the darkness, but the bullet went wide, striking a tree with a sound like thunder. They wrestled in the mud and salt. Marcus was stronger, but Elias had desperation on his side. Marcus landed 2 hard punches to his ribs, and Elias felt something crack inside his chest. Pain exploded through his body. He grabbed a fistful of mud mixed with salt water and shoved it into Marcus's eyes. The man screamed and released his grip on the revolver. The gun sank into the water. The 2 masked men dropped from the trees. They tackled Elias, driving him face first into the mud. One of them kicked him in the stomach while the other wrapped a heavy iron chain around his neck. The links were rough and cold. He could feel them digging into his skin, drawing blood. They dragged him backward to the stone well. Silas walked calmly into the clearing. He looked down at Elias, who was chained to the stone base of the well. The water was rising. Elias was already chest-deep in the salt water, his breathing becoming labored as his lungs worked harder against the pressure. "Do you know why the walls only weep clear water, Elias?" Silas asked, his tone almost educational. "Because salt purifies. It burns away lies. It burns away the past. And now, you see, the well is finally full enough to do its work." Silas pulled the silver locket from Elias's pocket, the locket he'd taken from the attic. He opened it and showed the photograph to Elias. Eleanor, the woman with the scar, the woman with Elias's own eyes. "Your father didn't kill a stranger," Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He killed your mother because she was going to tell the world about this town's corruption. About the men who disappeared, about the money, about all of it. And I helped him. We were brothers once, in the way that men who share secrets become brothers." Elias froze. He looked at the woman's face in the photograph, really looked at it, and he saw himself reflected there. Not just in the eyes, but in the shape of the chin, the curve of the jaw. A memory surfaced from somewhere deep, from the part of his mind that held childhood images. A woman singing a lullaby. A woman with a voice like music. The same voice he'd heard sobbing inside the walls of his house. "You were the one with the shovels," Elias said, and it wasn't a question. Silas nodded. He began to shred the letters into the well. The papers scattered as it fell, and where the ink touched the water turned black. Deep, oily black, as if the words themselves were being absorbed into the salt. Silas looked up at the sky as if expecting something, and then he turned and walked away. Marcus and the masked men began to throw heavy stones into the well. The water erupted. It shot upward in a column of pure force, reaching 20 feet, then 30. It wasn't just water anymore. It was thick, viscous, and filled with pieces of cloth and fragments of something that might have been bone. The eruption hit Elias in the face, filling his mouth with salt. He gasped, and the chains pulled him toward the center of the well by the weight of their own momentum. A sound came from the water. A roar, a scream, a voice that wasn't quite human. but was absolutely alive. It was the sound of a woman screaming from inside the earth. It was the sound of 70 years of pain and rage and unanswered sorrow, finally given a voice. Elias hung by his chains in the darkness of the sealed well. Above him, only 3 feet away, a brick wall had been erected by Marcus and Silas and the masked men. They had built it with methodical precision, layer after layer, until the circle of sky was completely blotted out. He could hear the scrape of the trowel on the last brick, the squelch of mortar being applied. Then silence. Total silence. No sound except his own ragged breathing and the slosh of water below him. The water level had dropped from his chest to his waist to his knees. It was receding, leaving him hanging above the sludge at the bottom of the well. He was 3 feet above the mud. He was suspended in perfect darkness. He was alone in a sealed tomb. "They buried me," he whispered to no one. Just like her. He remained there in the dark for what felt like hours. His arms ached. His neck hurt where the chain had cut into his skin. His ribs screamed with pain from the beating he'd taken. He tried to remember if he'd ever been afraid before. Truly afraid. The kind of fear that erases thought and leaves only sensation. He couldn't remember. There was only this. The darkness, the cold, the chains. His fingers found the locket in his pocket. It was still there somehow, still clutched in his clothing. He opened it. Even in the darkness, he could feel the outline of the photograph, the edges of the metal frame. His fingers traced the shape of Eleanor's face, his mother's face, his mother, who had tried to save the town from itself and had died for it. The key. There was a key inside the locket. His fingers found it, a small piece of metal, almost too small to be real, hidden inside the frame. He pulled it free. The padlock that held his chains was just above his head. He tried to reach it before, but his hands had been numb, his movements sluggish. Now, with the key in his hand, he tried again. He fumbled in the darkness. Twice he missed. Twice the key didn't engage with the lock. The third time, he felt it slide home. He turned. The lock opened with a click. The padlock fell into the darkness below him. It hit something solid, bone, stone, and made a hollow sound. Elias dropped to the bottom of the well. The impact knocked the air from his lungs, but he was free. The chains lay coiled around him like dead snakes. He felt along the stone walls in the darkness. His hand sank into a gap, a space between 2 bricks that had never been properly sealed. It was the opening to an old drainage tunnel, he realized. The wood that had once covered it was so rotted by salt and age that it crumbled at his touch. He kicked, and it shattered completely, revealing a passage beyond. Elias crawled through the narrow stone tunnel. The walls were bleeding. He could feel the moisture on the stone, cool and fragrant, smelling of jasmine and something that might have been perfume. These were different tears than the ones that had flowed from his bedroom wall. These were gentle. These were sad. These were his mother's. He crawled for a long time, his knees scraping on stone, his hands reaching ahead into darkness. The tunnel seemed endless. But then his hand struck something. A ladder. Iron rungs, slick with moisture but solid. He climbed. His muscles screamed in protest. His breath came in ragged gasps. But he kept climbing. At the top was a trapdoor made of heavy oak. He pushed. It was stuck, swollen with moisture, sealed by age. He pushed again. The wood groaned. The hinges screamed. The door opened into a familiar place, the basement of his own house. He could see the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. He could see the crate of road flares his father had kept for emergencies. Elias pulled himself out of the tunnel. He stood in his basement, covered in white salt from head to foot, looking like a vengeful spirit risen from the grave. He checked his reflection in a small cracked mirror. His face was barely recognizable. His eyes were hollow. His skin was white. He looked like death given human form. He grabbed 3 road flares from the crate. He ignited the first one, and red smoke bloomed around him like a flower opening. He ignited the second and the third. The smoke was thick and acrid and beautiful. "Time to dry the walls," he said to the empty basement. "Time for the town to pay." Silas was standing on his porch when Elias walked toward him across the square. The elder was looking at the sunrise with the peaceful expression of a man who had survived another day. His expression changed when he saw Elias walking toward him, a man burning red flares, a man covered in white salt, a man who should have been dead, sealed in a well, forgotten forever. "Impossible," Silas said, and his voice shook. "You were sealed." Behind Silas, the walls of the general store began to bulge. Huge blisters formed in the wood, each one filled with liquid, each one swollen to the breaking point. Elias watched without moving. He simply held the flares high and watched. The blisters burst all at once. A deluge of salt water hit Silas like a tidal wave. It swept him off the porch, knocked him to the ground, carried him 15 feet across the square before depositing him in a broken heap by the town monument. He coughed and gasped, his mouth filled with the taste of 70 years of sorrow. The bronze monument began to crack. Huge fissures opened across its surface. Clear water shot out from the statue's eyes, then its mouth, then its chest. The metal groaned like a living thing in agony. It tore itself apart, and as the pieces fell away, revealing the hollow interior, a cascade of old bones spilled across the cobblestones. Not one skeleton. Dozens. Hundreds. The remains of people who had been missing for decades. The remains of everyone who had threatened to expose the town's corruption. The remains of Eleanor. And with them came the water. Endless, unstoppable water that washed across the square like a flood. Elias stood at the edge of the water as Silas struggled in the flood of bones. The elder was thrashing, trying to keep his head above the surface, trying to find solid ground. Elias walked to him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket. He dropped it onto Silas's chest. "Everyone knows now," Elias said, and his voice was calm and final. "The walls have finished speaking." The sun rose over Oakhaven, turning the flood of tears golden. The water carried the bones across the square, into the streets, to every house in the town. The salt left behind a permanent mark, a white stain on every surface, a reminder that could never be cleaned away. The town itself had begun to weep, and now it would weep forever. Elias walked past the Welcome to Oakhaven sign at 6 a.m. He was carrying a small suitcase. He stopped and looked back at the town one final time. Every house was white now, coated in a thick layer of dried salt. The streets had turned pale. The trees had turned white. The town looked like it had been hit by a blizzard that had come from underground, that had reached up from the earth itself to mark every stone, every window, every brick. There was no going back. A small girl stood by the side of the road, playing with a wooden doll. She looked up at Elias as he approached. Her eyes were perfectly clear and absolutely blue, like water held in a glass. But there were no pupils in her eyes, just clear liquid, trembling slightly as she looked at him. "Will it be quiet now?" the girl asked softly. Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply walked past her, one foot in front of the other, the suitcase handle warm in his hand. He touched his own cheek. There was moisture there. He looked at his hand. The liquid was crystal clear, warm to the touch, absolutely ordinary and absolutely terrible. He realized then that he was the one who had been narrating the entire story, that as he spoke the words, the memories, the confessions, he had been slowly transforming. His